I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the impact of Russia's strikes on energy and civilian infrastructure, preview the American midterm elections a week before the US goes to the polls, and reflect further on the daring attack on the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Ukraine can win, Ukraine must win, and Ukraine will win.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 1st of November, day 251. And today, live from Kryvyi Rih in the centre of Ukraine, I'm joined by Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. From Washington, our Washington editor Rozina Sabur, and former commander of UK and NATO CBRN forces, Hamish to Bretton-Gordon. Just a note from me, Joe's connection from Kryvyi Rih, the city in the centre of Ukraine where he's reporting from at the moment, is a little spotty. His audio quality isn't always perfect. Thank you for your understanding. Joe, can I come to you first? You're on the ground in Ukraine. Where are you and what have you been doing?
Hi folks, I'm currently in Kryvyi Rih, the hometown of Volodymyr Zelensky. But it's a really interesting place, despite being kind of the birthplace of the Ukrainian president. It's famed for its steel and iron ore mining industries. It's one of those towns in central Ukraine, kind of towards the southern front line, which has a real sort of Soviet feel to it. Not a lot of people speak English here. Everyone has this, everywhere you kind of look has this sort of orange tinge to it because of the dust clouds that blow from the mines. And legend has it, like locals will tell you, that some of the steel used to produce the Eiffel Tower was actually mined and produced in Kryvyi Rih. And so we travelled here from Kyiv for a number of reasons, not only because it's the main sort of city at the rear of the Kherson counteroffensive, but it also has its own fascinating story. So many reporters will pass through using it as a staging post to move further to the south. But the way that the city defended itself without having an army at the beginning of the war is just intriguing. I won't give too much away because I'm working on a dispatch for tomorrow's newspaper about the story of how one former politician who was living in Kryvyi Rih in the hours of February 24th, kind of the early hours, was able to formulate a plan to defend the city in the time it took him to smoke a single cigarette. And he basically used the knowledge of how the Soviet Union invaded the Czechoslovakia in 1968 because his uncle, a Soviet Union Air Force pilot at the time, had taken part in that. And he was able to kind of use his knowledge to basically defend from a huge Russian kind of onslaught. There was a tank convoy of 50 tanks kind of went towards the city, but eventually they had to abandon kind of attempts to capture it because of what he did. So I won't give away too many details because that's something you can read about this evening online or tomorrow's paper. And then what else have we been doing while I'm here? So we'd actually moved away from Kyiv about a week ago now, and we had the incident yesterday where it was once again the capital city was kind of left without power and water after the Russians had targeted like kind of civilian energy infrastructure in the area. Klitschko, the mayor, Vitaly, former kind of world heavyweight champion boxer, brother of Vladimir, who you also know, kind of made clear that around 80% of the town, or the city, sorry, it's offensive to call such a big city as Kyiv a town, was left without water. And so myself, Verity Bowman and Sergio Olmos, who you've both heard of on the podcast before, we wrote about the impact that this actually had on the water shortage had on the town. We told the story about how 4 hospitals in Kyiv had to abandon the surgeries because doctors didn't have sufficient water to sterilize their equipment. Dialysis machines treating kidney patients kind of ground to a halt because they didn't have enough water to run. And while hospitals all across Ukraine, I visited a number of them now, kind of working on another wider piece, which we can discuss another week about Ukraine's healthcare system, have really got to grips with the fact that they might be without energy, without power, kind of through the winter months. They brought in big generators, like running on diesel, to make sure all the intensive care units kind of remained kind of running and stuff like that, while there's these rolling blackouts across the country as a result of kind of energy infrastructure being hit by the Russians. But one thing they didn't bank on is water supplies being knocked out, and it's kind of it's a new challenge that while the Russians hadn't specifically targeted kind of Ukraine and Kyiv's water supply, they knocked out the power to 27 pumping stations, which supply the majority of the city. So this is a new kind of challenge that Ukrainians have got to get to grips of. But I think the real kind of key element of the story in the dispatch that we wrote up together was the fact that no matter how much the Russians throw at them, and it's now to the point where most people you speak to will say this is not kind of a military conflict. This is now a military targeting purely civilian infrastructure and civilian kind of populations, and they won't let it get them down. And it's quite remarkable. I know last time I appeared, I spoke about kind of people not ignoring the air raid sirens, but they are just determined. The people of Kyiv and in Kryvyi Rih as well, and other places I've been to in Ukraine, to really get on with their lives and not let kind of the Russians get them down, because they know that the Russians are trying to kind of drive them into submission with these kind of underhand tactics targeting civilians, but they won't let themselves be defeated. And then a few other things we've been working on. While we were in the Kryvyi Rih area, we visited a very kind of top secret factory facility where engineers were converting kind of pickup trucks, like Nissan pickup trucks, Mitsubishi pickup trucks, and they were attaching Grad rocket launching systems onto the rears of them, and basically turning these pickup trucks into mobile kind of artillery units that have been kind of ever present on the front line in Kherson ever since the summer when we first started catching images of those. And we got to look behind the scenes, and the piece is online if anyone wants to read further. But we kind of saw the process of how these machines are converted from regular civilian pickup trucks to these fighting machines that can kind of fire over distances of 10 to 20 kilometers. And actually one of the soldiers, Pavel, his name was, that I spoke to at the facility, he was coming to kind of inspect and check when the next pickup truck would be ready to send to the front line. And he's been the driver in a 3-man unit that takes these to the front line. And he said they are almost, or probably more effective than HIMARS and other kind of Western systems that Ukraine have been handed, because they can go where kind of these larger rocket launchers can't go, and they're slightly more stealthy. You can see a HIMARS system coming from a mile off, because if you're a Russian with binoculars. But what these things are, they're just a lot more stealthier. So he actually told me that he has fired one of these Grad kind of systems attached to the back of a pickup truck while his Russian enemies is just 2 kilometers away. So that's really close. It's less than just over a mile basically away. So these are really kind of mobile machines. It was fascinating to see kind of how ingenious Ukrainian engineers, more used to kind of producing tools for the pharmaceutical industry, had actually developed processes to kind of make weapons and basically help on the front line. And I thought that was really fascinating, and I would highly recommend that you kind of have a look on our website to see what is what. And then what else have I done while I've been here? So since I last appeared on the podcast, I sat down with Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv and former heavyweight boxing champion, as mentioned earlier. And we spoke about the need, basically, that while like weapons are great deliveries, and the Ukrainians will be forever thankful for those weapons, there's actually a need for kind of blankets and generators to be sent, more kind of humanitarian help to also be sent to Ukraine. So basically, the authorities can protect their civilian populations against what he said was Russia trying to use winter to basically commit genocide. He was of the opinion, as many Ukrainians are, that Russian forces are deliberately, now they're not having luck and not having it all their own way in Kherson, in Kharkiv, and in other regions of Ukraine where fighting is going on in the front line. they're now trying to make people's lives a misery and basically cause some sort of humanitarian crisis as the winter goes on. And it's just today we've actually, I believe, like in the UK, we've had sort of this Indian kind of summer where it's actually the end of October, we've been able to walk around in kind of just jumpers and no need for coats. But today is noticeably colder, and I think as we move on towards the end of kind of middle of November, we're gonna start to see kind of this humanitarian story really develop of people struggling throughout the winter because they've not got heating systems, they've not got kind of electrical systems that can keep them warm as Ukraine's bitter winter comes in. And then another really interesting piece that I put together when I was in Kyiv when I kind of brought it together, but it went online as I moved down to Kryvyi Rih, and it was I managed to get my hands on sort of a confidential report that had been drawn up by the Ukrainian authorities on basically these Ukrainian experts and kind of tech wizards have been researching what is inside the Iranian drones that have been downed over Ukraine. And basically what they've led to is that Iran, who is producing these drones, even though it is denying the fact for Russia, is basically circumnavigating Western sanctions by stuffing its drones with American technology, which is available on the internet. And so the report kind of goes along the lines that the Shahid 136 kamikaze drone, as we know it, has got kind of parts of its targeting system are similar to what you'd find in the DJI drones, which kind of you can buy in the shops in the UK. There's the commercial drones that every kind of drone enthusiast in the UK or Western countries have. GPS systems were coming from US tech firms. The engine was from you could buy on a Chinese e-commerce website, AliExpress. Parts of the fuel pump had come from a Polish firm. So what they were finding out is basically Iranian engineers were stuffing these drones that are being kind of raining down terror on Ukrainians from after being used by the Russians, are not actually full of Iranian kit. They're actually full of Western kit, and these Iranian engineers are basically whatever kind of everyday commercial technologies they can get their hands on. That's how they've designed these drones. And then there was another drone that's in use, and so excuse my pronunciation of it, but a Mohar 6, which is a reconnaissance and strike drone, also made by the Iranians, used by the Russians. And that had hardware produced by Japan, Sony, Panasonic, and Fujitsu inside of them, as well as kind of lesser known firms in the US, Canada, the Netherlands. And there was actually even a solitary chip that had come from and been produced by a Ukrainian firm that was inside these drones. We don't know when the drones were made, but what we do know is actually Iran has been kind of canvassing the Western market looking for parts, commercially available parts that it can use to create military weapons. And that's a worrying thing. And I think from my kind of conversations with Ukrainian officials, they've really been keen to highlight this with kind of the G7 countries, with the EU, with the UK, the US, Japan, basically asking them to cut down on technology that Iran is allowed to get hold of, because they know, because they've ripped these machines apart after they've been blown out of the sky, examined them and realised actually it's not Iranian kit, it's Western kit that Iranian engineers are putting together. And that is one way that the Ukrainian government thinks will help them combat the issue of drones, is if basically Western companies, whether they know about it or not, are selling items to Iran for this. But I'll stop there. If you ask any questions or carry on.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, just one question from me. That was incredibly comprehensive, so I don't have too many. You mentioned interviewing and meeting Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv. I just wanted to ask what your impressions of him at this point in the war were. Dom and I met him, interviewed him back in July, and I think we were struck by his sort of assuredness. He looked very good. He sort of he exuded authority. I mean, what were your impressions?
Dom and I interviewed him in June at the NATO summit in Madrid as well. So. And unfortunately, I didn't. I'm a keen boxing enthusiast. So him, Vitaly, and his brother Vladimir was two of the boxers that I kind of grew up watching. So it's almost a bit of a fanboy moment when you meet him. And he actually invited us up into his office. We were meant to meet him out in the street while he was taking delivery of 2 ambulances and a fire engine donated by a kind of a German aid foundation. But he invited us up to his office. He was like, "Oh, come on, let's have coffee and let's have a proper chat." So it was really nice. But yeah, you're right. He does kind of have this aura about him, which I guess comes from his days as a boxer, where he had to be a media personality. He's used to kind of standing in front of the camera and reeling off these kind of lines about kind of his enemy in the other side of the ring, in the other corner. But his lines don't change. What he is really kind of keen to push and keen to do is highlight to the West that this is what Russia's doing, and this is what we need help with. And we actually, what was quite intriguing, I spoke about how the war comes to an end with him, and he was quite resolute in the answer. And I was like, what conditions? He's not a member of the government. He's not even a member of Zelensky's party. And I said, what do you think Ukraine and the Ukrainian government should do in terms of finding peace? And he was like, we should not accept peace until every Russian soldier has left the country. Vladimir Putin and anyone involved has faced trial, and reparations have been paid. And I said, does that include Crimea? Because a lot of kind of Western leaders would probably exclude Crimea, and they would look at returning Ukraine to the February 23rd lines. So kind of rolling it back to just before the full-blown invasion. He was like, no, we're going to get everyone out, and that includes Crimea, because Crimea is Ukrainian. And then what I like about him, he's very emotive. So when I said how much is enough in terms of Western aid, and he leaned forward and he put his fists on the table, and I'm trying to bang my desk in front of me like he did. And he's got, as you can imagine, he's 6'7". He's a former world heavyweight champion boxer, so his hands are massive. And he just said, enough is enough when the war is over. And so he is basically saying that Ukraine is going to fight tooth and nail for every inch of its territory back, and he is fully behind that. But what's great to see about him, yes, he's a celebrity. Yes, he probably, because he's a celebrity politician, not everyone in Kyiv is a huge fan, because they see it as him trying to maybe push his brand at times. But actually, they're coming over. They're appreciating what he's done. Him and his brother turn out, and they go and see if there's ever been kind of drone strikes, missile strikes in the center of Kyiv. They'll go and visit it. They'll be some of the first people there, kind of helping, delivering aid, and making sure there's an arm around kind of anyone that's lost a home or anything like that. So what you see is a really committed chap who is fighting for what he believes is right, and you cannot kind of doubt his devotion to a Ukrainian victory.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, can I bring you in here? Joe talked about the missile strikes, and something obviously we've talked about in the past, Putin's unconventional warfare. That's attacking the grid, key energy infrastructure and other infrastructure. You've had some thoughts on this. Would you like to share them?
David and everybody, good afternoon. Joe, a really, really good explanation there. I think absolutely one of the key things here on the unconventional war, as I and others are calling it, it's interesting that General Spyakin, who some know as General Armageddon, who I think developed a lot of his thoughts about this in Syria over the last 4 or 5 years, he's now been in command for about 4 weeks now, and we're really seeing the sort of zenith of this attack. I'm not sure it's not just on infrastructure, it's really attack on civilians. And the idea being is that the Russian military have been unable to get anywhere against the Ukrainian military, and in fact are now going backwards in some places quite rapidly. But if you take down the civilian population as well, if you try and break their will, then the idea is that they will persuade their government to sue for some sort of some sort of ceasefire. Now that clearly is not happening, and in fact, you see people getting stronger by this. It just shows that there, when you're unencumbered by morals or scruples, you can do virtually anything. And what has been doing is this systematic hitting primarily of the power infrastructure and lights going out, and what the knock-on effect that, of course, as we've heard, that water has also been affected. Really, it's how we develop from this. The Ukrainians are doing tremendously well, allegedly sort of knocking out about 90% of these missiles that are these precision-guided missiles, cruise missiles that are at the front of this, and also the Ukrainian kamikaze drones that we're hearing so much about. So they are actually doing a heck of a job here. But with the winter coming on and everything else, I'm sure Putin wants to, turn the heating off and freeze everybody as well. It seems that the civil defence and state emergency services are really well organised, and certainly what I've seen of them, they are doing a great job of rebuilding and getting things back to normal, and that is something to be lauded. I think one of my additional concerns, and just going back to one of Joe's points about the hospitals, attacking hospitals and schools is exactly what Assad and the Russians did in Syria, and with great effect. And I think one of the concerns of where does conventional warfare go from here? We've discussed on the pod a lot recently about the sort of dirty bombs on the nuclear side. And Bob Seeley and I, Bob is the MP for the Isle of Wight and a great thinker on Russia. We are currently just finishing off a sort of, I'd say academic with a sort of small A paper on this, on where we think we're going. I think when we look at conventional warfare and the electricity grid, we mustn't forget that when the war started, 60% of Ukraine's power was coming from nuclear, and this is an area that I am really concerned about. I know that the International Atomic Energy Agency have got people on the ground. But we were only hearing yesterday, I think, the Russians were saying that the Ukrainian military had blown up a landmine at Zaporizhzhia, this massive power station that we've discussed, which again seems ridiculous to me. The Russians control Zaporizhzhia. The only people who are going to blow up a landmine in a reactor there is going to be them. So I think that is an area of huge concern moving forward. And we need to, and I hope that the international community will make it absolutely clear. And I know that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, did last night, and also James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, reiterated that any they did say any nuclear weapons would elicit an overwhelming response. I really put Zaporizhzhia in there as well. To me, we heard a couple of weeks ago out the Russians, or even last week, discussing the West about to use a dirty bomb in Ukraine. Well, I actually think that Zaporizhzhia might well be the Russian dirty bomb, and that would have a huge impact there. What one is trying to do is actually sort of give some advice to civilians in Ukraine. At the very beginning of the war, we discussed, myself and some others produced an app so people could survive chemical and biological attack. At the beginning of the war, the Russians were threatening false flag there. And just updating the app now, which is on Telegram, to really tell people how to prepare, make sure they're well prepared, and what to do if there is a nuclear accident or a deliberate use of radiation or a dirty bomb. And hopefully that, and I'll try and make sure that we get that across as wider platforms as possible, so that the people of Ukraine can have an idea of what to do. And one hopes that it's terrible talking about these sort of threats, but if the Russians do have any morals at the depths of their soul, if they know that actually blowing up somewhere like Zaporizhzhia will not have the impact that they hopefully they won't do that. So I think we are seeing the unconventional warfare develop. It's become more of an issue as the weather turns, but I think it is absolutely tightening the resolve of the Ukrainian people to resist. And hopefully it is tightening the resolve of the international community, the Europeans, ourselves and the Americans, to keep providing Ukraine with all the wherewithal so that they can prevail in this conflict, and also that we can protect civilians as much as possible. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. Just one question to you before we go to Rozina in Washington. You mentioned early on in your piece just then about how this unconventional warfare, the strategy from the Russian military for the last few weeks, follows very closely the playbook from Syria, which you saw yourself. Can I just ask you to explain to our listeners what actually happened in Syria and how did it turn the war there in Assad and Russia's favour? In this, I guess what I'm getting at is, if that's the playbook, how did it work in Syria? Why did it work? And how does that relate to our understanding of Ukraine at the moment?
Well, that is the nub of the issue here, and these, I would say, these are not directly similar conflicts. They are. What is similar is that the civilians are at the heart of it. The fighting is going on with the civilians there. Usually one tries to get the civilians out of the way, protect them, get them out of the fight. But in both Syria and Ukraine, the civilians are actually absolutely the heart of the fight. And in Syria was a civil war rather than a war between states. And what was happening is that the civilian population, on the one side, you had the sort of people who are rising up in Syria, and you had a number of different rebel groups, some pretty unsavory, who were fighting amongst them. And then you had the Assad regime, who were trying to suppress the conflict. And in many cases, civilians were in certain areas. And Aleppo, I think, is the best example, where about 500,000 civilians were surrounded by the Syrian regime forces and Russian forces. And they fought, the Syrians fought conventionally for 4 years to try and get the civilians to really give up the struggle, and the fighters who were with them to give up the fight. And what we saw there is that Aleppo was razed to the ground. They put so much conventional explosives into Aleppo, and basically it was rubble. And people hid amongst the rubble and survived. The doctors under fire. We supported a bunch of hospitals in Aleppo and in Idlib. And I think we lost over 1,000 people over that sort of 4 or 5 years in Aleppo, 1,000 doctors and medics. Super cynical. The rules of war and the Geneva Convention protects hospitals, mosques, churches, synagogues, etc. And even in a conflict like Syria, one would give the United Nations the exact location of one's hospitals and churches, etc., and those would then should be protected with a sort of imaginary circle around them. But what we found in Syria is literally the day after this information had been given to the UN, who then shared it with the Russians and the Syrians so that they wouldn't attack them. That's exactly what they did. They attacked them, and we've seen exactly the same in Syria. What is of real concern for me at the moment, particularly with all the talk of Russian false flag, chemical, biological and nuclear attack, of course, the thing that made the difference in Syria were chemical weapons. The 4-year siege of Aleppo was broken by 17 days of chlorine barrel bombs, pushed out of helicopters. You had hundreds of thousands of people hiding underground. A lot of them were killed underground, or they were forced above ground, where they were killed or captured. And that to me is the playbook. Now, we haven't seen chemical weapons used, but we've seen everything else: attacks on hospitals, attacks on schools, the use of things like white phosphorus, which to set fire to buildings, which we saw quite a lot in the early days in Ukraine. We haven't seen it now, but again, you wind forward to the suburbs of Damascus. Assad used chemical weapons in a place called Khan Shaykhun, the nerve agent sarin, in 2017, and again in a place called Douma, chlorine barrel bombs. and they broke the sieges. So, I sort of go back to my early points. If you have no morals or scruples and you're unconstrained by what you do, all these sort of weapons are at your fingertips. And I think that's why, particularly on the sort of nuclear dirty bomb side, we need to be very much on the balls of our feet, which is why, the little things that those of us who were in Syria found worked, like simple training courses for civilians to be able to react, have an impact. So they are different conflicts. One absolutely accepts that. But unfortunately, some of the protagonists are the same. And it seems what they found successful in Syria, they're trying to replicate in Ukraine. However, against a very different foe, and one that is supported by the might of NATO. So they should not prevail.
Well, thank you very much for that rundown, Hamish. We'll come back to you later to talk about your thoughts around the Nord Stream attacks and the Ukrainian attack on Sevastopol. Rozina Sabur, can I come to you? Rozina is our Washington editor, coming in live, talking to us live from Washington. The midterms are in exactly a week. You've come on this podcast a few times in the past few months just to give us a sense of how American voters feel about the issue of Ukraine and how the American parties are talking about it in their campaigns in the midterms. What's the latest from you? You've been out in Georgia and Nevada speaking to people. What are they telling you?
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. Yeah, it's a great time to speak to you today. Very fortuitous because, as you say, it is just 1 week before Election Day in the US. I'm back in Washington at the moment, but I've been on the road a fair bit during the election campaign. So lots to share. But just briefly to give listeners an oversight to begin with, the midterms will determine not just the balance of power in the US Congress for the next 2 years, but also Joe Biden's mandate to govern for the second half of his term. So they're of huge significance, not just for domestic policy, but also because they have incredibly wide-reaching implications for US foreign policy. I can get on to the foreign policy implications in a while. You mentioned, how it will affect support for Ukraine. But if you'll humour me, I would like to use the opportunity to give you a brief rundown of the midterm campaign and the current state of play, because it is really interesting and it's not something we often get to talk about in quite so much detail on the podcast. And given that it is a week away, it seems like a good opportunity. So we could start with the US House of Representatives. So to briefly explain to anyone that doesn't follow this very closely, every seat in the House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years. So all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up. So currently Democrats have a majority in that chamber, about roughly 8 seats majority. They've had a few open seats recently. So pollsters predict the Republicans are going to seize control of the House. Now, there's a lot of talk about a red wave. So, the GOP sweeping this huge majority. It's actually quite hard to forecast just how large a majority they will command, but it does seem fairly safe to predict that they will be taking control of that chamber. Now, what's much harder to predict is what's going to happen in the Senate. Really, really interesting to watch this because this will be decided by just a handful of critical states. So to break it down, currently the Democrats control the Senate by the tightest of margins. So this 100-seat chamber is split 50-50, but the vice president, Kamala Harris, has the casting vote, the deciding vote. So, it couldn't be tighter. Senators hold 6-year terms, and roughly a third of them are up for re-election this year. Now, a lot of those are fairly safe seats. So this essentially means that the race will be decided by a clutch of states. Now, they are 2 states currently held by Republicans, Pennsylvania and Ohio, and 3 states held by Democrats, so Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia. So I've traveled to the last of those 2 in recent weeks. So I was in Las Vegas last weekend speaking to casino workers who will play a huge role in the race in Nevada and as a consequence in the Senate as a whole. Now, the issue on everyone's lips there is the cost of living crisis, the rampant inflation that Americans, just like Brits, are battling at the moment. So I was lucky enough to go out door knocking with one of the largest, actually the largest union in Nevada, which has a huge role. The unions are the real power brokers in Nevada's politics. So, out with the casino workers and knocking on doors, they're campaigning for the Democrat senator there. But the issue on, most voters' lips isn't, Democrat or Republican. It's actually, how am I going to afford to fill my car up? That Nevada is the state with some of the highest gas prices in the nation. So those are the issues that are playing out there. The other big nationwide issue dominating this election is abortion rights. And that's because, as many listeners will know, the US Supreme Court ruled to strike down the law that had granted women a constitutional right to an abortion for the last nearly 50 years. That provoked a huge backlash among a lot of voters. Polls show that the majority of Americans do actually support some level of abortion access, and most of them actually supported the status quo, which was, 1973 ruling Roe v. Wade. But since the Supreme Court decision, dozens of states have moved to enforce new restrictions, and some have actually enacted pretty restrictive bans. So that was the big issue in the minds of many Democrat voters I spoke to in Nevada, but also in Georgia, where I was a couple of weeks ago, where there was the only debate happening between the two leading candidates in that race, and another very interesting race. So we have a rare instance of two African-American candidates facing off against each other. So the incumbent is Democrat Senator Raphael Warnock. He's a longtime pastor. He's actually the pastor at Martin Luther King's former church, a storied church in Atlanta, Georgia, very long history and legacy in terms of the civil rights movement. And he's facing off against Herschel Walker, which is a name that might be familiar to some of you. He's quite a famous former American football player. Kind of enjoys legendary status in Georgia because he played college football for the University of Georgia. And for anyone who doesn't know, in the South, college football is almost a religion in itself. So he's kind of got a cult following there, and he's been handpicked by Donald Trump as the Republican candidate to run in that race. Has the backing of Donald Trump and a large part of the Republican Party, but is a candidate with a very checkered past. There's been various claims of domestic abuse by his former wife. There have also, in recent weeks, been a number of scandals engulfing him by two former girlfriends who have claimed that he paid for them to have an abortion. Now, Walker is staunchly pro-life. He's likened abortion to murder. So that issue, again, very dominant in the race in Georgia. And we can talk about the other states if you like, if we've got time. Pennsylvania, Arizona, Ohio, all very interesting races. But the issues that came to mind in Georgia and Nevada when I was there in the last couple of weeks are really, abortion and the cost of living and how that's going to affect, not just the balance of power in the US Senate, but how Joe Biden will then govern for the final part of his term.
Well, thank you, Rozina. That was a comprehensive and I think a much needed overview of the issues Americans are thinking of a week before the polls, a week before the midterms. So can we push this slightly? How does the issue of Ukraine and American support for Ukraine fit into this? Was it mentioned on the doorstep at all? What issues is it connected to in voters' minds? And I guess the secondary question to that is, how might that support, how might the US's diplomatic stance towards the war change depending on the results?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. The way it plays out isn't usually as direct as, well, I'm pro-Ukraine or I'm against supporting Ukraine. But like I said, the cost of living is a huge issue. When you speak to voters, they can rattle off the gas price of the day. They can, they'll tell you exactly how much the cost of bread, of cauliflower, or various groceries has increased in the last few months. They're very, very aware of how this is impacting them. Now, where that comes to play with Ukraine is, we talked about the fact that the Republicans are very likely to take control of the House of Representatives. The Republican who's likely to be the party leader in that chamber, he's likely to be the next Speaker of the House of Representatives, is Kevin McCarthy. Now, he has a kind of a mixed record, but has allied himself quite closely with Donald Trump and has actually faced some dissent among his ranks from, more right-wing, more Trump loyalist members. And he's actually expecting to get a larger number of those, of that flank of the party in Congress after this election. So there is pressure from the right wing of the Republican Party to actually be more fiscally restrained, to spend less money. We've seen these massive military assistance packages signed off by Congress. And what Kevin McCarthy has said recently is, we're not going to write a blank check for Ukraine. Kind of signaling that the window is closing on these huge military packages. Now, that has to be read in the context that Kevin McCarthy has a leadership election coming up in which he will be vying to be the next Speaker of the House of Representatives. And so part of that will be, aimed at his base and appeasing the right wing of his party. We've seen the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, actually be very forceful in his support for Ukraine and for these, big spending packages. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, and we really do have to wait and see just how large the Republican majority is in the House of Representatives. But there is no doubt that, the window is closing on those big packages. And I think it's unlikely we'll see these same sprawling financial packages signed off in the way that we have over the summer, say. Actually, one other thing to mention is, when you speak to Republicans, I actually had lunch with a former Trump official the other day, and they're actually, despite the kind of rhetoric from what we sometimes call the MAGA wing of the party, of the Republican Party, which is, quite concerned about huge spending at a time when the American economy is suffering and the American public is, struggling with the price of everyday living. Despite all of that, what this one Trump official said to me is actually, when it comes down to it, we will back Ukraine. We will continue to support this effort because the cost of not doing so is just too high. And despite, the rhetoric that is maybe a little ramped up around the election, when it comes to January and we have a new Congress in place, we will continue to see solid support for Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Rozina. Just one question from me, then I believe Joe has a question as well. And after that, don't worry, Hamish, we'll get to your thoughts on Sevastopol and Nord Stream. But just very quickly, Rozina, a story's come out yesterday that we've reported on about basically, Joe Biden, we think in June, lost his temper with Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, when they were talking about assistance to Ukraine. Can you just talk us through this story? I mean, I know it was back in June, but it does throw a new light on the relationship between the American president and the Ukrainian president.
Yeah, very interesting. So the report, I think it's by NBC News, which is that Biden reportedly lost his temper and raised his voice on the phone with Zelensky in June, as you say, after another one of these huge military assistance packages that we've just been talking about. I think that one in particular was about $1 billion. And Biden is supposed to have, reminded Zelensky that actually the American people are doing a huge amount. And, the US has spent considerably more than any other Western ally in terms of supporting Ukraine. So, a valid point to be made there. And just kind of reminding Zelensky of what this is costing the US. And, to remember that, that there is some level of dissent among American lawmakers. Now, why was he so frustrated? Well, we know that Biden has a bit of a temper. We've seen him respond quite irritably on a number of occasions. That's the type of person he is. It's quite easy to envisage how that might have gone down with Zelensky, even if we are only hearing about it secondhand. But the reason he would have been angry, is this awareness that public support isn't unlimited, that, the American public is suffering, and, actually Biden's suffering as a result. We've seen his approval ratings, hovering around the high 30s, kind of low 40s. And actually, the point was made the other day that when petrol prices went down, Biden's approval ratings went up. But now that petrol prices have gone back up again, Biden's approval ratings have declined slightly. So that his approval ratings do seem to be very closely linked to this cost of living crisis that Americans are experiencing. So, that's why he was so frustrated. We know that, maybe this congressional support for sending billions of dollars to Ukraine is fading. But I think the other, point to make is, as you say, this happened in June. Why are we hearing about it now? Has this been strategically leaked by the administration to, make the point clear to Americans that, Joe Biden isn't writing a blank check in the way that Kevin McCarthy, had kind of talked about in recent weeks. So it's very interesting, but it does really reflect the mood that we've just been talking about, and the predicament that Joe Biden and the Democrats face in terms of wanting to continue this huge support, but not alienating Republicans and not alienating the American people.
Well, thank you very much, Rozina. Just very quickly, we do actually have at The Telegraph a new podcast out about the midterms. It's called The Red Wave. It's presented by our colleague Stephen Edgington. There are 2 episodes out already. So if you do want to learn more and hear more about what's happening in America, do go to The Red Wave on any podcast app or on the Telegraph website. So thank you for that, Rozina. Joe, I know you have a question.
Thank you. Hi, Rozina. I'll try and keep it short, but in the summer I was having lunch with a sort of a diplomatic kind of security source in London, and they were saying that people in the UK kind of government apparatus are becoming consciously aware that the US is potentially going to become more inward-looking when it comes to foreign policy. While Ukraine might not be the kind of priority or the first thing you think of, because it's like in the immediate future, this is happening, but they were thinking more towards the China-Taiwan issue. So I just wanted to kind of gauge your opinion on whether, like, the next generation of US politicians, whether there's been any signs in the midterms that kind of US foreign policy might take more inward-looking, maybe a Trump-esque America First policy, rather than like kind of this outward-looking Biden approach where he's kind of tough on China, he's tough on Russia, and basically, will they be more inward-looking in the future, do you think?
That's an interesting question. I suppose the answer to that isn't quite so straightforward, in my opinion. Like with many things about Donald Trump and his kind of platform, it's not quite as straightforward as isolationist bent, meaning kind of turn inwards and not focus on Russia and China. I think, this is just my personal opinion, but I see a bit of a split in the way Republicans approach Russia and the way Republicans approach China. A large part of that, I think, is because if you go to, the Midwest in the US, if you go to the Rust Belt, these areas that have seen economic decline, a loss in manufacturing jobs, many of them will tell you that they hold China responsible. They see a direct link between economic decline in the Rust Belt in the US and the growth of China. So actually, a lot of Republicans who you might kind of term isolationist, or you might consider not to be, quite so eager to get involved in Russia, Ukraine, actually are incredibly hawkish on China and actually a lot of GOP rhetoric in the MAGA kind of wing of the party is quite focused on China and is hugely critical of China. So I don't think that a move away from, America being a big global player on the world stage in future would necessarily mean the same for China. And I think that's, one of the few instances where, Joe Biden and the kind of moderate wing of the Democrat Party and, a large part of the Republican Party are quite aligned, actually. So yeah, as with everything with Donald Trump, it's not quite so straightforward. But obviously a lot can change between here and now. But I suppose one of the reasons there has been incredible bipartisan support for these actually huge, when you step back and just look at the sheer figures, billions of dollars, huge figures in spending. A lot of that isn't just because they want to defeat Putin. It's also because they want to send a message to Xi Jinping and warn him off doing something similar in Taiwan. Now, obviously, the reasons for that are distinct. Taiwan has huge implications for US manufacturing. It's obviously a large provider of semiconductors and all the rest of it. And in terms of global trade, the Taiwan Straits has huge implications. So I think there's a slight difference between the approach to Russia and China, but at the moment, many American officials see being very hawkish on Russia as a way to be hawkish on China. That's quite a long-winded explanation. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Rozina, and thank you, Joe, for the question. Time is starting to run short, so can we move back to Ukraine? And yes, Rozina will absolutely get you on next week after the midterms, and you can dissect for us what's happened and what this might mean regarding Ukraine. Let's go back to Sevastopol, the attack on the Black Sea Fleet that happened on Saturday morning, and the Nord Stream attacks. Hamish, I know you had some thoughts about this. I mean, the Russians have floated the idea that the British Royal Navy might have been involved. What do you say to that?
Well, I will. We could probably do a whole pod on this, but I will try and keep it short and sharp to a few minutes. And I was and have always been a specialist rather than special. But I think these are two distinctly different events. And I'm sure those people who have been watching SAS Rogue Heroes on the BBC will know why David Stirling and Blair Paddy Mayne set up the UK Special Forces, which is all about getting behind enemy lines, attacking key areas at the back, as they call it, to cut the snake in half so that the front bit withers away. And with that in mind, if we look at the Nord Stream attack, first of all, and the Russians have been very demonstrative that this is a UK operation and insinuating it's UK Special Forces. But it makes absolutely no sense, and I agree with the government rebuff on this. It makes no tactical advantage to have a Special Forces operation. First of all, it's not behind enemy lines. It's within, the sort of European territory of influence. The only thing it would do, if it was UK Special Forces, it would hack off, the Germans and the French, who hope eventually for, gas to flow through that particular pipeline. The only people who benefit from it is actually the Russians from having an impact there. And to put Nord Stream to bed, most NATO countries have very effective special forces. And this would not be an area that UK Special Forces necessarily operated in. So I think we can put the Nord Stream to bed. That very clearly is, I'm sure, on the Russian sort of Spetsnaz or somebody else's target list. We go to Sevastopol, slightly different issue. This is well behind enemy lines, a well-constructed operation here, which will have a strategic impact. You can imagine, it would appear that an awful lot of Russian soldiers and sailors have not really got the stomach for this fight. And if they now know that their enemy is all around them, they can be, shot in Sevastopol as easy as they can be, shot in Kherson. So I think that has a sort of strategic impact here, and attacking the fleet. It is a classic special forces operation, sort of envisaged by David Stirling, and UK special forces are still really the gold standard, around the world. Does it have UK special forces SAS fingerprints on it? No, I'm sure it doesn't. Does it have their hallmark? Yeah, absolutely. Again, going back to the development of special forces by David Stirling and the team back in the Second World War. If you, I'm talking to you from the edge of Salisbury Plain at the moment, and if you could hear above the shouting of my dogs, you would be able to hear some firing going on in the background, which is, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers being trained by British and actually by Australian and New Zealand and European soldiers for the fight there. Are there Ukrainian special forces being trained as well? Well, I don't know, and we'll never know. One would hope there probably are. So I think, the answer to your question, I think the operation at the weekend in Sevastopol is a classic, special forces type operation. It will have a strategic impact. Nord Stream strikes me as another Russian false flag, really personifies, the disinformation the Russians are trying to put forward, and the only people who will gain from that are the Russians. So that is hopefully a simple run through of those particular operations and the way that special forces might operate. And we know that Ukraine, have very effective military and no doubt very effective special forces.
Thanks, Hamish. Just very quickly, I'm wondering how to phrase this question without sounding massively speculative, but I guess, would you be surprised if in 5-10 years' time we discovered that this attack was conducted by Ukrainian special forces and there had been some training link with the Royal Navy with UK special forces? If you're saying that this attack has all the fingerprints, has all the sort of the hallmarks of what the special forces might do, would that surprise you?
Well, I think it has all the hallmarks because as I try to, it is the UK special forces, it's the SAS who developed these type of skills and really sort of led the world in it. So it has their hallmarks on it. And of course, there, over the years, as we've been training the Ukrainians and a whole host of things, no doubt there have been exchanges of special forces. I don't think we will ever find out if that was the case. We will ever find out whether that's so. I wouldn't be at all surprised that it's heavily influenced by what capabilities we've developed, and I think it's good for the Russians to understand that they can be attacked wherever, and the heinous crimes that they appear to be committing one day, they will have to account for that. And just as a final thing, one of the things I said to a lot of people in Syria is, eventually these people who commit crimes will find their way to the International Criminal Court, as most of the generals who committed atrocities in Bosnia and Kosovo do. And I hope that General Savakin and his like will, in due course, end up there as well.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish, Joe and Rozina. Is there anything from Joe or Rozina you think we should cover very quickly? I'm very aware we're running very short on time. Or shall I just ask quickly for your final thoughts? What are you going to be looking at in the days to come? And what would you like our listeners, what do you think our listeners should be thinking of?
Thanks, David. I suppose, the final thing I would close on is, from my own experience as a British reporter here in Washington, you do meet British government officials and representatives as they come through. We're obviously speaking to, the Biden administration and people on Capitol Hill as well. And actually the hallmark of all those conversations is just how in lockstep this Western alliance has been and the willingness to continue supporting Ukraine. And, that has transcended some very different political ideologies. So, we've seen Joe Biden, really sticking the boot into Liz Truss during her brief premiership, hitting out at her on her economic policies, maybe unheard of, or at least incredibly unusual for a US president to do that to a serving British Prime Minister. But when it comes to Ukraine, they were very much on the same page. And, we've seen that continue with Rishi Sunak now in Downing Street. And I think, that's just been a very interesting hallmark and an interesting takeaway that I've had from speaking to people in both sides of the Atlantic. Regardless of political ideologies, they are very committed to supporting Ukraine throughout.
Thanks, Rozina. Hamish, would you like to go next?
Yeah, just two very quick ones, please. We talked a lot about conventional warfare, and I will be giving a lecture at Cambridge University on the 17th of November with John Simpson on this, and I'll put a link on my Twitter and copy it to the Telegraph as well. And I think the other area that so many people are concerned about the nuclear piece here. I think in this country there is no need to be overly concerned, and having protect and survive reissued by the government is probably not necessary. But I am concerned in Ukraine, and we're doing all we can to make sure that civilians are protected as best they can. And I will share the link to the Telegram training piece for surviving these sort of things as soon as it's up in the next day or so. Over.
Thank you very much, Hamish, for that. And do follow Hamish on Twitter if you want to see more of that. Joe Barnes, you're in Ukraine. What are your final thoughts?
So my final thoughts today is keep watching the Kherson counteroffensive, because we know Ukraine's forces are kind of edging closer to the city of Kherson, the regional capital, the only regional capital that Russia has managed to capture throughout the 8 months of the conflict. Fighting has slowed down in the area. They've kind of seen less the Ukrainians have seen less casualties, and they've kind of, people I've spoken to have admitted, look, we're not pushing as hard as we are, but what we're doing is we're regrouping and ready to kind of go again. It's not going to be a quick battle for the city. It's well fortified. There could be up to 40,000 Russians there. But I expect the next week or two that Ukraine will start making a push back towards Kherson. And I would urge people to sign up to our kind of dispatches newsletter, where you kind of can read fun and kind of good bulletins from our foreign correspondents, because I've just filed over a piece about a bottle of Russian victory vodka, which was kind of produced to celebrate the Russian capture of Ukraine. It was bottled as kind of late as the end of August, and that was found abandoned in a liberated town by Ukrainian soldiers. So I think that's quite an amusing story, that the Russians thought they were going to be celebrating with vodka, branded Russian victory, or for the Russian victory, and now they're leaving it behind kind of in the dirt tracks when they're making haste and getting out of these liberated villages. So that's where I'll leave it there for this week, or today.
If you enjoyed Rozina Sabur's discussion of the American midterm elections, why not listen to The Red Wave? It's a new podcast from The Telegraph, presented by my colleague Stephen Edgington. Do go and find The Red Wave wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app. Check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.